Mic test, mic test, mic test, mic test. So, good morning class. 3 a.m. March 25, 2020, Wednesday. First case ng COVID-19 kaninang mga around 5 hours ago. So, ingat kayo dyan. So, for now, ang i-discuss natin ay contracts. Now, ano ang contracts? Well, according to Article 1305 of the New Civil Code of the Philippines, a contract is a meeting of minds between two persons whereby one binds himself with respect to the other to give something or to render some service. So, just observe nakalagay dyan, to give something or to render some service. Anong meaning yan? Ibig sabihin, obligation to do and obligation to give. Wala dyan ang obligation not to do. So, take note of that. Now, kung matatanda natin, may mga essential elements ang contract. Well, for now, yung other elements muna ang i-discuss natin. First is natural elements. Ano to? These are elements that are found in the contract unless set aside or suppressed by the party. So, basically, sa isang contract, automatic nandyan ang natural elements. Mawawala lang siya kapag yung parties na mismo ang nag-alis sa kanya. Ano mga sample niyan? As nakalagay dyan, warranty against eviction at hidden defects. Yung warranty against eviction, yan yung hindi ka basta-basta mapapaalis. Itong hidden defects, pag nagkaroon ng hidden defects yung isang bagay, pwede mo siyang ibalik o ireklamo, refund, or whatever the law states about that. Next is accidental elements. Ano to? These are elements that refer to a particular stipulations of the parties. So basically, nandyan yan siya kasi yung parties na mismo ang naglagay sa kanya. Simple lang, di ba? Now, punta na tayo sa classifications of contracts. Ito, marami to. Now, first, according to perfection or formation. Ano yan? Una, consensual. Meaning, perfected by mere consent. So, basta nagkasundo ang mga parties, automatic HTFM. Perfected ng contract. Next is real, which is perfected by mere delivery of the object of the contract. Now, itong delivery na to, kung matatanda natin, either actual or constructive. Yung actual, binigay mo, dineliver mo. Ang constructive, parang abstract lang siya, representation. And since yung iba hindi nakasagot ng tama sa kinds of constructive delivery, reminder lang, tradition, simbolika, ito yung title, like for example, title ng land, hindi mo naman actual madideliver ang land, di ba? Bigat nun. So, ang gagawin mo? Yung title of land, yun ang ibibigay mo. Yun ang i-deliver mo. Yan ang tradition, simbolika. Now, ang tradition longamano naman, yung delivery na gagawin mo is pointing the object. Kumbaga, nandiyan ang object sa harapan mo. Sabihin mo, as you point to that object, sa'yo na yan. Dinideliver ko yan sa'yo. Next is tradition brevimano, which basically, you're already there. Nandyan ka na sa object na i-deliver. Lastly is tradition constitution possessorium. Basically, ito yung you own it, then you sold it, but you want to rent it. Anong sample niyan? Well, kung matatanda natin sa FAR natin, sales leaseback. Kumbaga, binenta mo na yung bagay, then, na-transfer na ang ownership. Then, ang gagawin mo, i-rent mo yung binenta mo. Sales leaseback. Yan ang isang sample ng tradition, constitution, possessorium. So, parang konting sidestep lang yan sa delivery. Next is formal or solemn. Ito yung may kailangang form because it is prescribed by law para yung contract maging perfect or can be perfected. Yan ang formal or solemn. Now, punta naman tayo sa according to cause, which is first onerous. Ano yan siya? Well, exchange of valuable consideration. Meaning, parang ito yung sa sales, exchange, sa barters, kung saan, kung ano yung binigay mo, ganun din yung estimated value ng matatanggap mo. Next is yung gratuitous. Now, as opposed to onerous, itong gratuitous naman, one party receives a benefit while the other receives no equivalent consideration. Anong sample niyan? Mga one-sided love, donation, succession, inheritance, yan. Gratuitous yan sila. Now, next is yung remuneratory. Ano to siya? Accordingly, it is the cost of the service that is being benefited or remunerated. A primary example of that or the very good example ng remuneratory contract, for example, dati, may nagligtas ng buhay mo. Then after some time, gusto mong ibalik yung favor sa nagligtas sa'yo. So, anong gagawin mo? Bibigyan mo siya ng pera. So, ano nangyari? Well, the service or the benefit that was remunerated in this contract is yung pagligtas sa'yo ng tao. And with that consideration, bibigyan mo siya ng pera. Now, as form of pasasalamat sa pagligtas na sa'yo. So, that is a primary example of a remuneratory contract. Ngayon, punta naman tayo sa according to importance or dependence of one upon another. To basic to, principal, one that can stand by itself. Next, accessory, one whose existence depends upon another contract. So, si accessory, always niyang pina-follow si principal. Next is si preparatory, one which serves as a means by which other contracts may be entered into. Anong primary example niyan? Yung mga prenuptial agreement before magpakasal ang tao. Kasi ang marriage clause, it is a special contract. Itong prenup, ito yung preparatory contract para it will guide anong magiging relationship ng mag-asawa sa kanilang marriage. So, prenuptial agreement, example ng preparatory contract. Now, next is according to designation in the law. First is nominate, those which have a name under the law. Gaya ng sabi ko, marriage, according to the Family Code, Article 1, it is a special contract. May pangalan siya. Binigyan siya ng pangalan ng batas. Next is yung innominate, those which have no name under the law. So, si do ut des, do ut facias, fascio ut des, at si fascio ut facias. So, ito yung mga contract na wala siyang specific name or a name for it was not provided by the law. Next is according to risk or fulfillment. Commutative, kung saan where parties give equivalent valuable prestation. Next is aleatory, the fulfillment of the contract depends upon chances. So, as ganyan, risk or fulfillment. Next is according to the parties obligated. Unilateral, only one of the parties is obliged to give or do. Parang one-sided love. Bilateral, ito yung gusto natin, kung saan both parties are bound to give or do. Pantay-pantay, equal. Diba? Next is according to time or fulfillment. Now, ito, na-discuss na natin to kung matatandaan nyo. Executed, a contract which has been performed, kahit na partial performance yan, executed pa rin yan. Walang executory, a contract that is not yet performed. Yung wala talagang performance na nangyari. Wala, as in, kaput. Ganun. Now, punta tayo sa according to number of persons physically entering into the contract. First is ordinary, where two parties are represented by different person. And by different person meaning, mga ibang may different representative sila. While sa auto contract, only one person represents both parties to the contract. Now lastly, according to the number of persons who participated in the drafting and preparation of the contract. Ito, ordinary rin, kung saan both parties participated in the drafting of the contract. Next is contract of adhesion, whereby only one party drafted the contract. Ano magandang example niyan? Yung mga loan contract ng mga bangko, financial institutions, diba? Pupunta tayo doon, automatic. Kung maglo-loan tayo, automatic, mayroon na yun silang nakahandang contract na ang gagawin na lang, isa-sign na lang natin. Now, next, saan tayo? Stages of contract. First is preparation and conception. Kung saan dito, it ranges from manifestation of interest to the contract to the arrival of a definitive agreement. Ito, kumbaga, parang yung parties nag-uusap pa lang na, oy, paano to? Gusto mo bang pumasok tayo sa contract? Parang dyan na yun, sasabi mga ideas nila, kung ano gusto nila mangyari sa contract, parang negotiation ba? Usap-usap. Now, pagdating sa perfection or birth of the contract, ito, it represents the stage when both parties have finally arrived definitively to the agreement which constitutes the subject of the contract. So dito, nag-agree na ang party, o sige, yung mga napag-usapan natin, gawin na natin. Ilagay na natin sa contract. Diyan na, nagkaroon na ng perfection or birth. Now, kung may nanganak, ibig sabihin may mamamatay. Kaya nandito si consummation, death, or termination of the contract. Ito yung stage kung saan when the parties already fulfill or perform the terms agreed upon in the contract, which then leads to the extinguishment of the contract. Siyempre, yung natapos, ay yung nasimulan mo, may katapusan yan. Gaya ng contract. Dito, pag nagawa mo na lahat ng obligations mo, siyempre, tapos na ang contract. Basic ng contracts, di ba? Now, ito, basic principles of the contract. 5 to sila, kung matatandaan nyo. Pero ang una, si liberty of contracts. Ano to? Well, it indicates that the parties may establish stipulations. Meaning, kung mababasa nyo dyan, pwedeng yung parties may liberty sila or may karapatan silang maglagay ng stipulations or kung ano man makasunduan nila sa contract, provided na hindi ito contrary to lamok paps. O tandaan nyo yan na, parang mnemonics yan siya, lamok paps. Ano yan siya? Law, morals, good customs, public policy, and public order. So basically, ang liberty of contracts, ang party, may liberty or may right or may freedom sila na maglagay ng mga stipulations sa contracts kung ano man gusto nila. As long as it is not contrary to lamok paps, laws, morals, customs, public policy, and public order. Now, sa next principle naman tayo. Ito, mutuality of contracts. It refers to the binding force between parties in the contract. It also indicates that the validity of the compliance cannot be left to the will of one of the parties. So, ito, basic, mutual ang contract. Na kung sino man yung mga parties sa contract, binding to sa kanila. Punta naman tayo sa relativity of contracts. Ano to? Well, it states that contracts take effect only between the parties, their assigns, and heirs, except for the rights and obligations are not transmissible by law, stipulation, and nature. So basically, syempre, kayo nagkontrata, bakit mo idadamay ang ibang taong walang participation or interest sa contract na yon? Ang contract, mag-e-effect lang yan sa parties, sa assigns or sa heirs kasi sila may interest sila sa contract dahil ang connection nila ikaw. Yung mga ibang tao, mga third persons, usually wala naman silang labot dyan sa contract na yan. Bakit sila masasali? So ang contract, it is only relative to the parties that are involved in that contract. Gets? Ito notes lang. Siyempre, gaya ng ito, may general rule tayo sa relativity of contracts. Kasi sabi natin, ang relativity of contracts, it only affects the parties, their heirs and assigns. And since yan ang general rule, anong meaning yan? Ibig sabihin, may exceptions. And ito na sa baba, ito na yung mga exceptions. Kung saan, it can be enforced by or against by third person. Kung itong first, meaning kung yung contract is conferring or deliberately giving a benefit to the third person or a favor to a third person, which is known as stipulation for atruy, then the third person can demand its fulfillment provided he has communicated his acceptance to the obligor. Next, when the third person induces another to violate his contract. So dito, itong si third person, bad influence. Sabi niya, uy, huwag mong gagawin yung contract na yan, ha? So ito si third person, dahil sa ginawa niya, hindi finulfill ng party yung obligation sa contract. So it is a violation because it has caused damage to the innocent party. So, bawal yun. So, pwede ka mag-go against the third person. Next is, in contracts creating real rights, third persons who come into possession of the object of the contract are bound thereby, subject to the provision of mortgage and land registration law. Diba? Ang real rights, ano yan? It is your right against the world. Ang personal right, it is your right over that personal thing. Pero ang real right, it is your right against the world in terms of the possession or in connection to that possession of the real property. And since you're conferring that right against the world, which are the third persons, Diyan na papasok yung third bullet point, as provided or subjected to the mortgage law and land legislation laws. Lastly, in contracts intended to defraud creditors, the law gives them protection of third persons acted in bad faith. Ito na yata yung, if I remember correctly, is action Pauliana or action Aquiliana. Malalaman natin, nakalimutan ko ang term. Basta ito yung pwede mong i-rescind yung contract. Kung nakita mo, yung purpose ng contract ngayon is to defraud the creditors. Now, punta naman tayo sa fourth basic principles ng contract, which is consensuality. Ano to? Contracts are perfected by mere consent, generally. Pero, so, kung since generally yan, ibig sabihin may exception. First is real contracts, the perfection of which occurs upon delivery of the object or prestation. And lastly, formal or solemn contracts, the perfection occurs upon acceptance and compliance with the form prescribed by law. So kasi generally, ang contracts, basta nag-consent ang party, ayos na yan. Pero, sa mga real and formal contracts, may kailangan pang considerations or requirements bago ma-perfect yung contract. And lastly, the last principle, obligatory force of contracts. Ano yan? Ano yan? Contract shall have the force of law between the contracting parties and should be complied with in good faith. And upon the perfection of the contract, the parties are bound to the following: fulfillment of what has been expressly stipulated, and all consequences which, according to their nature, may be in keeping good faith, usage, and law. So basically, itong obligatory force of the contract, it is compelling you to follow or to do what was obligated or stipulated in the contract. Kasi kung walang obligatory force ang contract, walang gagawa niyan. Walang gagawa ng obligation nila sa contract. Lalo na pag yung obligation na ngayon sa contract is nakakasama sa kanila or unfavorable to them. So, dapat ang contract may obligatory force para yung mga tao makompel na gawin yung obligations nila para walang gulo. Ganun lang kasimple yung pips. So, abangan ang part 2.